Lithium-ion batteries, the same batteries used in most electric vehicles today, hold an incredible amount of energy inside them. And in the last decade, the energy density of batteries, how much chemical energy a battery can hold per unit mass, and the power density of batteries, how much electrical energy a battery can output at any one time, have both improved dramatically. These improvements are what has led to both more affordable electric cars, but also cars that are longer-legged, travelling further between charging stations. But what hasn't changed all that much is the attitude in the mainstream media to electric vehicle fires. Fires that seemingly grab far more attention than any of the more than daily occurrences of internal combustion engine fires, partly because electric vehicle fires tend to burn hotter, longer, and are more difficult to self-contain, and they can mysteriously reignite hours or even days after the original fire began. They can be a nightmare for first responders, and now the US National Traffic Safety Board, the NTSB, has published a scathing report on electric car fires that has led, and we think will continue to lead, to some pretty breathless headlines about electric car safety. These headlines focus on the scary part of dealing with an electric car fire, using quotes from fire departments calling electric cars the equivalent of those trick candles that you might have had at one time on your birthday cake as a child. Quotes that emphasise how these fires cannot be put out using conventional firefighting methods. And, while thankfully I've not actually found this in any examples yet, I'm expecting certain news outlets known for their distrust of electric cars to go all out in their primetime editorial slots to yet again raise questions about how safe these fancy new eco-cars are. You know, anchors at channels that may or may not rhyme with box. I say nothing. So today, in advance of all of that salaciousness, let's yet again look at electric vehicle fires, but this time from the standpoint of looking at the differences between electric car and non-electric car fires, examining what the NTSB's report actually says about them, and highlight what needs to be done in order to safely, and with as little sensationalism as possible, fight electric car fires. And most importantly, prevent them before they happen after a collision involving an EV, which frankly is a far more frequent cause for an EV fire than just a spontaneous EV fire. First, let's look at our relationship with fire. We humans have changed quite a lot since our ancestors left sub-Saharan Africa and began to explore the world. But while modern-day us may not have a whole lot in common with early humans, there are still a few things that strike fear into our hearts, things that we're still learning to control. One of them? Fire. We may now happily use controlled fires to warm our homes and cook our food, but uncontrolled fires get our amygdala hijacked faster than a Tesla Model S Plaid, accelerating to 60 miles an hour. And if you're me, the sudden, inescapable rush of adrenaline can cause its own problems, pushing your heart to pump blood around your body so fast that it might absent-mindedly forget which chamber needs to contract next. Don't you just love inherited genetic conditions? All jokes aside though, fire, along with earth and wind, and volcanic eruptions, belong to that special group of threats to our very lives that we've still not 100% figured out how to deal with. But, how does it go? That's the way of the world, so we're kind of stuck with it. As the wildfires that swept much of the world last year have taught us, containing a fire that has plenty of fuel to keep it running is kind of hard. Luckily though, the majority of fires out there are ones that we can and do regularly keep under control. Regular house fires, often caused by a discarded cigarette, an electrical short, or a kitchen appliance left on, are things that your local fire department can handle every single day. Depending on the type of fire and where it is, fire departments will use a plethora of different firefighting equipment and sprays, from good old-fashioned water to foam cannons, to rein in the fire or allow it to burn itself out in a controlled manner. Then they'll set about making the area safe. And the same is true for car fires involving internal combustion engine vehicles that have either caught fire because of an impact, which usually ruptures the fuel line or the fuel tank, an overheating engine, a fuel link in the engine bay, or an electrical short. There are literally thousands of vehicle fires that occur every day of every year, and fire departments around the world are thus well aware of and well trained in how to deal with them. The majority of fires, be they house fire or internal combustion engine vehicle fire, are pretty easy to deal with because of something called the fire triangle, or combustion triangle if you prefer. If you were the kind of person to pay attention in school science class, I'm sure you're probably very familiar with it. If you spent all of your time writing love notes to that cute redhead 3 desks over, or spitballing the nerd in the front row, I'm going to enlighten you in a very generalized fire triangle 101 kind of way. In order to have combustion, fire, we need 3 things. We need heat, fuel, and oxygen. Without any one of those elements, a fire cannot happen. Heat is the thing that provides the source of ignition, fuel is the thing that the fire consumes as it burns, and oxygen, or an oxidizing agent, is what reacts with the burning fuel to release heat and CO2. Obviously, fuel can be any material that is capable of combustion. The lower something's flash point, the lowest temperature at which the vapours of a volatile material will ignite with an ignition source, or the lower the ignition temperature, the temperature at which a substance will just spontaneously ignite without an external source of ignition like a flame or a spark, the easier it is to generally get burning. This is often shorthanded as flammability. The more easily something catches fire and the more quickly that fire can spread throughout the material, the more flammable it is, and the more flammable materials generally have a lower flash point or ignition point. Although not always. Which brings us to oxygen. On Earth, about 21% of the air we breathe is made of oxygen. So when a fire starts, there's always just a lot of oxygen sitting there, ready to interact with the heat source and the fuel to keep that fire burning. The more oxygen available to the fire, the more easily it will spread, and the hotter it will burn. Higher oxygen concentrations can lower your ignition point and make those materials burn more efficiently, i.e. hotter, for longer. Which brings us to the putting out of fires. We humans have used water to put out fires for millennia, and for many types of fires that works really well. Water attacks 2 of the 3 sides of the fire triangle at the same time. Water makes contact with whatever is burning and smothers the combustion by restricting its access to free oxygen, which effectively drowns out the fire and subdues it. At the same time, water that comes to rest on the thing that's burning can help cool it down by taking some of the heat energy from the fuel to heat the water, ultimately causing the water to evaporate. Again, I'm not going to go in depth here, but you get the idea. And in the same way, in some cases, fire departments use specific foam formulations designed to smother the fire and prevent certain chemical reactions from going on that could make the fire more intense. So far, so good. It works for home fires and it works for most vehicle fires involving internal combustion engine vehicles because petrol and diesel do not contain any oxygen, and these fuel types, hydrocarbons, are basically a bunch of carbon and hydrogen atoms arranged together in very long chemical chains. In fact, side note, the main difference between, say, methane, ethane, propane and butane, all of which are hydrocarbons, is the actual length of those chains. Because petrol and diesel-powered vehicle fires require an external source of oxygen to keep them burning, smothering them with water or foam to prevent oxygen from getting to the source of heat and fuel will ultimately cause the fire to fizzle out. And as long as you keep the vehicle cool and deal with any unburnt excess liquid fuel, then that's the way it will stay. If you'll remember from earlier on in this video, however, I noted that different materials burn at different temperatures, and when materials burn at very high temperatures, they interact with the world very differently. Your campfire, for example, can quite easily be put out with a bucket of water because the energy in the fire is not enough to change the chemical composition of the water. But the hotter a fire gets, the more likely it is that throwing water on it or some types of firefighting foam could make things a lot worse, and electric cars are one example of this. You see, while internal combustion engine fires can range anywhere from 480 degrees Celsius to 815 degrees Celsius, 900 to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, electric car battery packs contain materials that burn at a much higher temperature. Gasoline might technically contain more energy per unit mass than an electric car battery, but an electric car battery burns far hotter than a gasoline fire does. And therein lies the problem. At that kind of temperature, water, H2O, undergoes a thermochemical process by which the hydrogen and oxygen within the water is split apart, producing hydrogen gas and oxygen gas. The newly liberated hydrogen excitedly explodes, and the oxygen, it just helps things burn even more intensely. The same is true of certain firefighting foams, which can also have pretty devastating effects if used improperly, undergoing thermochemical splitting to make the fire worse, not better. But luckily, when a small amount of water can cause flames to flare up in the short term, contained high-volume water application can eventually subdue the flames and reduce the temperature of the EV fire, ultimately bringing it under control. Even if the fire is successfully extinguished by using a lot of water, though, there's still a lot of energy likely stored in that electric vehicle battery pack, which in turn could lead to something called thermal runaway within the pack. It takes place when the heat energy being generated inside the battery through chemical reactions is larger than the heat energy the battery pack is capable of dissipating through its usual cooling methods. The battery gets hotter and hotter, and eventually it will self-ignite. And if a battery pack has been damaged by an impact or a fire, the structure within each individual cell within that battery may have been compromised. This means that internal shorts can and will happen. And for as long as the battery pack has energy stored in it and a voltage between an anode and a cathode, that energy will try and escape through those short circuits. Short circuits can transfer high currents through the cells or between them. That raises temperatures and again can reignite the battery pack. This is why it's important after an electric vehicle fire for first responders to monitor and continue to cool the pack long after the initial fire has been extinguished. One way to tackle this is to dump the car and the battery pack by proxy into a giant pool of water for an extended period of time. This has the effect of cooling the entire car and the battery pack completely, which reduces the risk of thermal runaway and reignition, but it also restricts the pack's access to oxygen. To keep cars and first responders safe, the car must remain submerged for a significant period of time. But wait, because EV fires don't happen all that often, and frankly, the EV fires that usually do happen, with the exception of a few dozen examples in recent years of an EV battery pack catching fire due to faulty battery cells or poor battery management, battery fires usually happen as a side effect of a vehicle accident. Just like many internal combustion engine fires occur after a traumatic event has happened to a car in question, like an accident, the same is true for an EV. Which brings me to the actual crux of the NTSB's report. While some media outlets are transfixing on the safety issues posed by electric vehicle fires, i.e. how they're more ferocious in terms of temperature and can burn for much longer periods of time, what the NTSB's report focuses on is the lack of appropriate training and information that many fire departments have in order to prepare them for responding to electric vehicle fires, and more importantly, providing first responders the necessary tools and skills to safely disable electric car battery packs after a vehicle accident long before the battery is in a situation where a fire is likely. It's prevention first, which, given how challenging electric car fires can be, makes total sense. Just like first responders will work at a scene of an accident to ensure there's no fuel spillage that could ignite, this report works to examine the process of making an electric vehicle battery pack safe. Today, most EV manufacturers make emergency response guides available to first responders, telling them where to safely cut to electrically isolate the battery pack. At the same time, though, the report found that those emergency response guides, while great to show how to safely isolate the pack, are lacking in information specific to extinguishing any potential fire that may occur. It also noted that after an accident, access to the isolation cut points in many electric vehicles, often under the hood, may be restricted after a severe frontal impact. It also raised the issue of stranded energy, the concept that after an accident involving an electric vehicle, there's this electrochemical energy stored in a battery pack that is incredibly difficult to safely deal with. In an internal combustion engine accident, it's sometimes possible to drain volatile fluids from affected vehicles using special apparatus to reduce fire risk. But in an EV fire, there's no standard way to safely discharge an intact battery pack in a post-accident scenario. And the report notes there's not always an easy way to safely store a wrecked vehicle with an intact, partly charged, damaged battery pack. The solution, it suggests, is for automakers to work to a single common standard, iOS 17.8.40, to present emergency response information, and that NHTSA in the US follows the lead of Euro NCAP to incorporate scoring relative to, quote, the availability of a manufacturer's response guide and its adherence to International Organization for Standardization Standard 17.8.40 and SAE International Recommended Practice J2990. In other words, it wants automakers and NHTSA, which is the government body responsible for setting automotive crash test and safety standards, to work together to better standardized EV emergency responder information. NTSB, while a government agency itself, has no regulatory authority. NTSB also wants the auto industry to work together to devise new safety practices for safely discharging an EV battery after an accident in which a car has not caught fire, but when a potential fire might happen if the battery is not safely discharged. Finally, it wants fire departments and cities to double down on training. First responders who know what to do in the event of an electric vehicle collision or fire are the first line of defense, and right now, very few fire departments in the US train for EV accidents and fires. Part of it is down to a lack of appropriate training nationwide. I mean, it's hard to train for something if you've got little guidance to go on, but a lot of it is also down to a lack of funding. And look, this isn't new. Every time a new construction technique or material is used in any vehicle, first responders need to be prepared for it. You only have to look at how magnesium wheels on race cars caused headaches when they were first introduced for trackside first response teams, until they figured out how to better fight fires involving cars with magnesium wheels, because of the temperatures involved. And the same will be true for EVs. Firefighters at the moment are still trying to figure out how best to fight EV fires. And without nationwide standards for training, it's going to take a while. Does this all make EVs less safe than internal combustion engine vehicles? No, not at all. Any vehicle that impacts another in an accident is at risk of catching fire. Petrol vehicles actually hold more energy in their fuel tanks than electric cars do in their battery packs. And of course, the gold standard when it comes to staying safe on the road is being an attentive driver. The best way to prevent the aftermath of an accident is not to have an accident in the first place. Battery packs in most EVs today are designed with fire suppressions designed to specifically reduce the risk and danger of post-crash battery fires. For example, Tesla uses flame retardant in its cells, and as its designs become more advanced, battery packs increasingly transfer impact energy around rather than through the cells, and this reduces the risk of internal shorts. Statistically, electric vehicles are far less likely to catch fire in everyday use than internal combustion engine vehicles are. Which brings me to the conclusion. What can you do? First, be an informed driver. Know where the safety information for your car is so that if something does happen to your car and you're able to do so safely, you can point first responders in the right direction for the reference material they need to safely work on your vehicle. Second, talk to your local council, your local politicians, and your local fire department. Ask them if they have an electric vehicle response training program, and if they don't, ask them why. While there's no requirement for such training to take place, a prepared fire department is a safer fire department, and campaigning for comprehensive EV first responder training can keep you and your local fire department safe. Finally, download the report. I've linked to it below, and maybe see if your favourite automaker would consider following the guidelines requested. After all, if everyone is following the same standards, it's going to be a lot safer for everyone. That's it. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.